Yeah, T-Rod MR2 says, "Lol, I never liked pedal dance. Just be nice to the car and don't drive like a hack at Joe."
Damn.
July 31st on Friday. Today's topic for the Annex Instagram Live is BRZ FRS GT86.
And we've got my car in the background. This is the vehicle that we've done a lot of testing on for us to help us develop Fast Road Pro as well as the Club Spec Pros. In fact, this car has the first prototype Club Spec Pros that we made for the production run. So this poor car has had the suspension on and off at least 40 times while we've developed over the last couple of years for this platform. So, yeah, here it is in all its glory.
Victoria says, "I missed that car." Interesting you say that, because Grant actually misses this car with Fast Road on it. So why don't we talk a little bit? Why don't we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, Club Spec Pro is for drivers that are primarily going to the track, and it is, it's fine if you're driving it on the road, occasionally, maybe a daily driver if you have a really high, tolerance for high spring rates and strong valving. Myself, I actually like canyon carving a little bit more than track use because I frankly, I don't have the time to be going racing all the time. So for me, Fast Road Pro is actually the product that I want on the car. Then on top of that, we changed our valving profile since we did the prototype set. So this is actually a more stiffly valved than our production CSP. So it has a very clamped down feeling, if you know what I mean. So it's we're looking forward to moving on to the next update to the Fast Road Pros and getting that one on there.
Joe M Racing just joined us. He is
Hey, Joe.
actually one of our sponsored drivers and also runs in 8.6 Drive Challenge and 8.6 Cup in California.
Yeah, it's funny. We were building Joe's shocks last night. We were doing an update. Huge thanks to Joe. Like Joe McGuigan is one of the main reasons that we got into 8.6 Drive Challenge, and he had some of the first track oriented setups that we've built. So his shocks are back in here, and we're doing a refresh for him to get him up to date to CSP, and a lot has changed. So we're really looking forward to his feedback. We're also testing a newer update to the piston, and Joe's going to be the first one to try him out. So we're really excited to hear your feedback, Joe.
Cool. Should we answer some questions people asked beforehand on the Instagram?
Yeah, that'd be great.
All right. So Albert, hi Albie on Instagram asks, what have you guys learned since sponsoring cars in the 8.6 Cup? I guess specifically related to the Club Spec coilover setup.
Yeah, before I answer that, Albert has an MR2 in his profile pic. Is that right?
Yeah, so he still has his AW11, a AE86, and I think those are his two driver's cars.
Oh, I wonder if he's thinking about moving to the GT86 chassis.
Yeah, I mean, that's one thing. It's like these are becoming more and more of a capable and price point good entry level track car. Like I'm not surprised why this car is so popular at the tracks now, right?
Yeah. I hope he makes a move. These cars are a blast. So we learned a lot. The FRS and, let's just call it the GT86 chassis. That is the first chassis that we took, road racing, and we learned quite a bit about shock tuning in general. So a lot of the principles that we learned from tuning on the FRS and BRZs specifically, those principles have migrated over to our other applications that we've developed for. And so it's been a really crucial time for us by working with the 8.6 Drive Challenge guys. And through that process, we learned that tuning for berms is a very specific task that required a lot of attention and detail. So we went. I remember on Thunderhill West, there's this turn 3. If you guys are familiar, when you go counterclockwise and clockwise as well, but from our experience, counterclockwise, there's this triangle in the middle of the turn on turn 3. You have to kind of crest it to get a good time. You have to really get maybe almost half the car over that crest, and it launches the car on one side, and then when it lands, the other part of the pavement is actually going up in the other direction. So it's almost like you get launched on one side and then land, and which rotates the car in the other direction. So you go through a huge amount of suspension travel and stroke going through that part of the track. And to be honest, our first valving did not do so well there. I remember riding in Joe's car and thinking like, "Well, we're really getting beaten up on this turn. We gotta figure this out." And then also we had some drivers go to Chuck Wallow, which has massive berms, and we didn't do so well there as well. But in that process, it really, the team really got together and we figured out, how are we going to attack this problem. So with the help of some shock position sensors, which you guys might have seen on the giveaway, we were talking about those shock pots that we've used quite a bit. Using those sensors, we were able to see what was going on with the vehicle when we were hitting those berms. So we could tell that the car was using a lot of the stroke on the inside, but especially on the outside corner. And we realized that we needed to do some updates to the compression valving to better adapt to those inputs. Don't want to reveal all our secrets on how we solved that, but we paid a lot of attention on the compression valving to solve that issue.
To your point about turn 3, T-Rod MR2 says, Joe is Mr. Stress Test.
No kidding.
Again, in regards to turn 3, Joe also says that he broke a transmission on the old T3 West height.
Whoa, I don't remember hearing that story. I'd like to learn more.
Yeah. And thank you guys. A whole bunch of people just joined us. Today's topic is the BRZ FRS GT86 chassis. So if you have any questions about chassis setup, this chassis in general, any of the Annex Suspension product line for this chassis, please let us know. Why don't we answer another customer question?
I got some more we can talk about.
Okay.
With that, yeah. If you guys own the GT86, you guys may be aware that these cars have very little stroke in the rear, and we also saw that as a bit of an engineering challenge. That if we could really understand the suspension on this car, which is quite complex for a few reasons, if we could understand the engineering challenges in this car and we could build a suspension that was working for it, I think that would pay dividends for us going forward and moving on to other applications. And that definitely turned out to be the case, because there's a lot of shortcomings on this car. It's also really capable once it's dialed. So there's we have a real love-hate relationship for these cars. Looking at the suspension side of things, the biggest issue that these vehicles have is the lack of stroke. On the front, so in the background, there's my car. I don't know if you guys can see it, but that's our CSP, and it's fully drooped out there. So you can imagine that my car is pretty low when it's actually on the ground, and there's not a whole lot of space above that tire before it hits the wheel well. So I, just roughly here, I'm holding my hands up, and there's probably a good maybe 5 inches of travel, maybe 4.5 inches of travel before that bump stop gets engaged. So you can see that if you're hitting a berm or you're hitting a large impact event on these cars, there's very little travel in the front. And it's the same thing with the rear. There's very little space for that shock. They have more upwards movement that's possible in the rear of these cars, but the shock itself is very short. So if you're asking the wheel to articulate and move a lot, and you have a very small shock in there, it's difficult to get that without running out of stroke. So those two things were a big part of the process, and I was trying to figure out how to make these cars go fast.
Joe has a question for us. How do you feel about cars like this that have a McPherson front and multi-link rear versus a full McPherson car or full lower LCA car?
Lower LCA car. Well, I imagine that Joe's asking about how this compares with the MRS that we also built some suspension for Joe's car, and I think some of the biggest differences I think are going to be in the alignment settings, right? Because on this car, it's got a strut on the front, which means that when the car is rolling and you're loading it up, there's not going to be very much camber gain. And this is very similar with story to the A86s, right? However, on the back of the car, the multi-link on the FRS actually picks up a lot of camber gain when it starts to stroke. So that allows you to run a much less negative camber than you would in the front. Because as the car is being loaded up and the car's rolling, that wheel is going to be rolling with the chassis, so that you start to run on the outside edge of the tire. And to combat that, you have to run more negative camber to get ahead of the curve, if you will. Now, on the rear, the tires are tucking in on their own, so they're actually adding a lot of camber dynamically as the car is loading up. So that lets you run a lot less rear camber in the back. On the MRS, I'd imagine that Joe probably needs to run more camber front and rear, because the struts aren't going to pick up camber like they will on the rear wheels will on the FRS.
Rob Destiny, the S2K, is on the live with us. Thank you again, Rob. And Rob, you nailed it right on the head. He says, I'd imagine the camber gain difference. And then Joe reiterated, he said, sorry, SLA, double wishbone car for the last one.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, double wishbones are the dream, right? If it's designed properly. I think we have some friends like Nick Romano that will talk about how double wishbone's not always an advantage. But theoretically, you can get lots of camber gain with a double wishbone setup. And this is one of the reasons why Miatas are so capable on track. They have a pretty well designed double control arm, double A arm setup, front and rear, and you can get a lot of braking grip, but because you don't have to have so much camber initially. And when those cars get loaded up, you can see in that photo that we posted on Instagram of Burstcraft's Miata, his NB Miata, you can just see that as the car is loading up, the tire just tucks in. You're getting lots of that lateral grip that you can take advantage of. And I think that's probably part of the reason that Miatas give MRS such a good run for their money, even though the MRS has a faster 0 to 60 time. The MRS has a midship layout, so it has better weight distribution. But you can see those Miatas are still making a ton of grip and on track, and so they can really take advantage of having that double A-arm setup.
Really fast, Victoria asks, how far along are you guys on your 2-way and 3-way adjustable setups? And that's a perfect time to ask that question, because we actually tested our 3-way setup on this chassis. Not this particular car, but on this chassis.
Yeah, that's true. And part of that process for us developing for the 86 Cup, we worked with Penske and we got some double adjustable Penske reservoirs onto our shocks, and that allowed us to really quickly hone in on the overall curve of the damper to see how to get the best results over berms and during transitions, and really push the envelope in that way. So that also highlighted to us that we want to have more sophisticated suspension setups for guys that are tracking religiously, right? So we are still working on a 2- and 3-way setup. We're doing testing now. The parts that we have look really nice, and we're looking forward to getting some track testing on track. And I have a feeling this car is going to get worked on one more time to test those out. So this poor car is going to have the suspension on and off
10 more times.
Yeah, 10 more times.
10 more times for sure. Yeah. Victoria also adds to her question, also, will there be an external reservoir included eventually? If so, what are your thoughts?
Yeah. Well, for sure, with our current architecture, if there's going to be a 2-way and a 3-way adjustable setup, there will be an external reservoir. And this is because you do the compression adjustments actually on the reservoir itself. In addition to the external reservoir is allowing you to adjust the damping, the compression damping, in addition to the compression stack that you have on the shock itself. So there will definitely be a reservoir. And reservoirs are nice. It's not, you're not just getting, I think a lot of times when people, you hear that reservoirs are better for performance, but until we got into this, it was kind of unclear why. But once we started testing and actually feeling the car and seeing how it dynoed, you can start to get a sense for what's going on. But essentially, that reservoir is not only giving you more fluid, so you're dissipating the heat better, because that reservoir has a higher heat capacity because there's more fluid. You've got some fluid in the reservoir as well, and the reservoir itself is also radiating heat along with the shock absorber. So those two allow it to get rid of the heat, and heat is bad for basically any mechanical thing on the car, shocks included. In addition to that, with that canister, you've got a lot more nitrogen volume that allows the air piston to move more freely without having spikes in pressure that you will on a monotube, especially a monotube that has very little stroke, like on the FRSs. So we've maximized the stroke as much as we can, but there probably will be some grip benefits just by having canisters alone on these cars. So we're looking forward to testing with that.
JSP John asks a question that is, he says slightly off topic, but it's completely on topic. We've answered this before, but it's worth reiterating. Have you guys found any significant suspension changes between early to current model GT86 chassis?
That's a great question.
And if someone wants one for track use, is there any benefits suspension-wise?
So as far as I know, the control arms are the same for all the way from 2012 builds to current. The main thing to look out for is there's a really nice damper made by Sax, SACHS, that I know is on the performance package for the BRZ and probably a few other packages out there. I'm only familiar with the science. I don't actually know which model years those were on, but I know in the racing communities, if you're in a totally stock class where you may not be able to, or may not have the points to change the coilover, that's like the damper to get. That's that Sax damper. And we've actually dynoed them here. Maybe someday we can put the plots up for you guys to see. And they have a pretty cool ride quality. They definitely feel more clamped down than the original issue Toyota or Scion or Subaru shocks made by, I think it's KYB that made the original shocks. But to be honest with you guys, like when my car was stock, I really did not like the dampers. Like they were uncomfortable. The body did not feel clamped down. It felt like there was a lot of hysteresis where the shock was not engaging when you're changing directions. It was really oversteery, which I know can be fun, but it's not the fastest way around, at least for my driving style. And then we had a customer car that brought in a performance package BRZ, and it was like night and day. That felt really nice. It kind of felt more like a European ride quality than it did like a Japanese car, which is kind of makes sense because Sax is a European company, I believe.
Yeah, Joe M Racing adds, bracing with the 2017 Plus is really the biggest difference. So yeah, for sure, the newer ones you get in all aspects, including chassis rigidity, they get better as the newer models you get. But I mean, to a certain point, if you're just getting into track driving, for example, like don't worry about, because that's just at like the pointy end of the spectrum, right? To get a chassis that's like the most rigid, it's much better to get for me, it's like if you're gonna learn, get the cheapest one and then learn on that.
So that's a great point. So we learned through Jimmy. Thanks for the tip, Jimmy. He looked at some documentation. He found that the performance package cars, they have additional bracing back there. And that would also explain why the cars were handling differently with the same spring rate. Because we looked at sway bar sizes and we're kind of scratching our heads. But then thanks to his tip, we've realized that they're actually stiffer on those later cars. But like Ezekiel's saying, you don't have to get the latest thing just to go racing. You're probably going to get way more benefit by having extra budget to get more seat time on track than worrying about getting the car that has just that little bit more rigidity. And, to this point, one of our customers, Tor, he competes in 86 Drive Challenge. He is one of the fastest guys in the street class. And he has a 2013 BRZ with like a zillion miles. And I think there's probably some additional chassis flex in that car compared to like a low mileage, 2019 model, which should, hold you back. But I just rode with him on track at Bunwell this weekend, and he's having a blast, and the car's putting down good time. So I wouldn't get too worried about that.
Yeah, try to get the mic like centered on yourself. So Joe has an interesting comment that also leads into some other viewer questions that were asked ahead of time on our Instagram. One thing Grant mentions is driving style. This car is one of the most Lego brick quotations type of cars out there. Can adapt the car to all sorts of motorsports and driving styles. And that leads up to Anthony's question, who asked us ahead of time on Instagram. And I know for sure Anthony has a drift car because he's got this it's like solid subframe, and he's got a hydro in that car. Just to give you guys some context. And he asks, time attack versus drift versus Auto X for this chassis. Angle mods, and then we'll answer those two first.
Excuse me. Okay, so we have experience. We have the most experience with time attack, and one of the guys on our team, actually, Jeff Wilson, he used to drive competitively with a FRS. He had a 2JZ in his engine, but I mean in his car. And I know those setups were pretty different. And then we also have a friend that is doing pretty well in autocross as well. And so you can kind of see the different philosophies. Time attack, you're mainly looking for trying to get as much mechanical grip and having good transitional speed. You're just trying to keep as much speed through the corners as you can. Whereas with autocross, it can be a little bit different. You might sometimes want to bias the car to be able to transition faster at the expense of ultimate grip. And so what I mean by that is some of the hot setups are to have a really large front sway bar, like massive. On our cars, we're using typically I think it's an 18 millimeter adjustable front sway bar, and an autocross setup might have a 22 millimeter bar, which is substantially stiffer, but then have a very, very soft rear bar, and then make up the difference in handling with having higher rear spring rates. And part of the reason for this is the car will transition a lot quicker if you have that stiffer bar, because it's essentially locking up the front and making the suspension a little bit less independent. But what you get from that is the car will change directions a lot quicker. And you can imagine if you're on track with a bunch of cones, that can be really helpful, right? If that car is changing directions really rapidly. Now, that being said, we feel that if you have too large of a sway bar, you'll actually reduce the amount of grip that you have. So that is a trade-off. You're trading off transitional speed for having maybe less overall grip if you're going strictly around a skid pad to do testing.
Drifter Anthony also asks, and you can tell this is a very drift-oriented question, can your camber plates paired with camber bolts get negative 5.5 degrees of camber up front?
I actually don't know the max amount of camber with bolts for our application on this car. I think the most that we are asked for is like 4 degrees for the guys that are racing, and I know we can hit that number. So I'm not sure what the actual total amount of camber is on this car.
Is there an advantage to running that much camber? Excuse my ignorance, but I know we've talked about before, like there's such thing as too much or too little per the tire, right? Or per the use of the car.
Yeah, no, 5.5 degrees is a lot. I think it really depends on what discipline you're looking for. For guys that are racing on track, that most certainly would have much hotter inside temperatures on the tire than the outside. And what that means is that the whole outside of the tire is barely being used, because it's the wheel is so tilted in that outside the contact patch is not even really being utilized. So no, I mean, for racing, that's very atypical. But now let's say you want to have a really nice ride height. You want the car to look cool, and you're trying to fit as wide of a wheel as you can. Then that camber is going to be helpful, right? Because you can tuck it in. And actually, I experienced this myself. I went a little aggressive. I have some 9.5-inch wheels on this car, and the internet said it would be fine. I put it on the car, and excuse me, I don't remember the offset. It was a long time ago, but I put them on the car, and they were not fitting. So I went to, I think, a little bit more camber than I typically like to run on the street. It's probably closer to 3 degrees, but I had to do that to get it to clear, and it's been fine ever since. But so sometimes you need the camber just to fit whatever whatever your goal is for the car.
Joe says on the Annex setup he's been able to get up to negative 4.5. So that's good to know.
Yeah, he knows better than I do.
Cool. Should we do the last question? Did we miss one?
Yeah.
Okay. So DC5 Sam asked us beforehand in our Instagram, what faults does the FRS chassis have after being lowered? Arm angle, travel, etc.? So for sure, I know in the rear, the angles get to be terrible. Like the upper control arm basically points right up to the sky, even when the car's not even, the ride height's not even that low.
Yeah, I guess it depends on how low we're talking, but so even you guys might have seen my gray car in some of the Instagram posts, but even at that ride height, you can't really have a streetable amount of camber on the rear without making changes already, just at that ride height. And I'm not that aggressive, I don't think. I mean, maybe by track standards, the car is a little bit low, but there's definitely a lot of like car meets where the cars are way lower than my car. But right away, we realized that we needed to get an adjustable lower control arm on the rear to reduce that camber gain that we were talking about earlier, to bring the wheels in to get a little bit better, to get less camber on the back. So right away, you kind of need to make that change if you're lowering the car significantly. And I don't think the front roll centers get too bad. It's not as bad as some of the cars that we've worked on before when they're lowered. However, like there, you do get you can actually have the upper control arm on the rear of the car start to hit the chassis. So I know guys that get really low, they have to get a special upper control arm to clear.
There's a few good comments about being too low in the rear in our live. So T-Rod MR2 says, too low in the rear and you break axles. Owinjo says, broken axles. Joe M Racing says, super fast axle death.
I was about to bring that up because we've been hearing that there have been a lot of axle failures when the cars are low. And as I was thinking about that as I was putting the car in the lift today, and I was looking back there, and yeah, I mean those rear axles are, I think on my car they were probably, if this is the center of the car, they're probably angled a good 25 degrees from horizontal, which, you know, if you can imagine, you only get so much articulation on that CV joint on the inside. That's it's somewhat extreme. So yeah, that unfortunately people have been realizing that's a weak point if you lower it, even at track car heights. So some of our customers and drivers that race have actually been raising their cars to have longer axle life, and also to stay off the bump stops a little bit more because it's so limited, like we were talking about.
So I know when you lower the ZN6 ZC6 chassis, there's actually hardware problems with the car, right? So one thing we discussed yesterday before we in planning for this live is there is no factory rear camber adjustment. So at a certain ride height, you may have an excessive amount of camber that you can't dial out.
Right.
So in that case, you would need adjustable or extended lower control arms. Another really common thing, because I regularly work on these cars, is when you lower the car on the factory front the sway bar end links, the end links are actually too long and they will point the sway bar up or down, I forget, but at the incorrect angle. And then also the lower part of that end link will, either contact the lower control arm. We've had a test car where the sway bar end links actually almost rubbed through the control arm. So, if you're going to lower your FRS, I would say adjustable sway bar end links are on the front are pretty much mandatory.
I totally forgot about that. Yeah, you're absolutely right. DC5 Sam asked also that if we were lowering the car about an inch, do we recommend a roll center adjuster kit? And I actually don't know the answer to that. We have not had any direct experience with roll center kits, but maybe some of you guys in the comments that have experience could help to answer that question for Sam. So yeah, I'm not sure how many of you guys have a GT86 and are thinking about going to the track, but I think what's often asked is, what do I actually need to do to the car before I can start tracking? And on these cars in particular, I think the first mod people recommend is getting an oil cooler kit. Would you agree with that, Ezekiel?
Yeah, if you're, man, hold that thought real quick, because another thing about sway bars that we totally forgot that we learned on your car, T-Rod MR2 says rear stock links also bind.
Oh yeah.
Do you remember back in the early days, like when we first were testing Annex and like the rear would just get out, would slide out on you unpredictably?
Yeah, that's right.
We learned the hard way that the rears also needed adjustable end links. And then depending on the angle, and then like the original end links you bought didn't go short enough. I think one of yours broke at one point. Somebody's.
I don't remember mine breaking, but yeah, you're totally right. When we first lowered this car, this is like the very early days, just when we were developing on this car and learning about suspension. But we lowered my car and it would just kick out. Like you'd hit a bump and the rear would just just rotate away. And then we were wondering what the heck is going on. Then we looked back there, and you guys have probably seen this on your cars, but the rear sway bar, the arm is like this long. It's very, very short, which is not ideal because as the suspension's articulating, the angle, relative to horizontal is just getting crazy. And when the sway bar starts to tilt up a lot, let's say it's like a 45-degree angle with horizontal, it's much more likely to bind in that state. So we address it by getting some third-party end links to bring it down, but it's still not quite right. And it's one of the things that I wanted to test someday is if we could get those that sway bar back down to horizontal, would that cure a lot of the kind of tail happiness that some of the autocrossers, complain about trying to get power down? Because I think one way they've solved this is by running a smaller than stock sway bar, which maybe that's it, or maybe it just needs to have the geometry corrected.
So back to your question on what are some good first items before your first track day. So Joe pretty much answered this really well. You can do a couple of cool days to begin with, but if you get serious, definitely look into an oil cooler. And, my personal ZN6 customers, they've told me they see up to like 270 degrees on their oil, just, canyon driving, which, and
yeah, that's right.
Their Band-Aid has to run a heavier weight oil. So, to that point, for me personally, I feel like these cars, being an enthusiast car, probably should have come with an oil cooler from the factory, some sort, right? Water to air, air to air.
Yeah, and the factory feels like nothing, right? It's like zero weight.
Yeah, 0.20 is the factory recommended weight. Yeah. What are some other items before your first track day? Should I buy Annex? I've never done a track day before. Should I just go ahead and buy Annex?
No. Yeah, I think if it's your first track day, and actually, one of our friends on the team is considering taking her car out to the track, and so we're kind of talking to her about this right now. But if it's your first time on track, definitely like focus more on the safety aspects, like making sure that you have a higher temp brake fluid, a hotter brake pad. Yeah, to that point, Joe let me take my car out onto track one time during the sessions, and I have, other than the Fast Red Pros I had on the car was totally stock, including the brake pads and the brake fluid. And man, did I smoke the hell out of those pads and the fluid. I basically needed to be bled like immediately after like the first couple sessions. So yeah, definitely want to upgrade the braking system before you go too far. Looks like we have a ghost in the warehouse.
Joe says, don't mod the car past your abilities or you will regret or never just track, period. And I completely agree with that, because I hate to say it, man, because I sit right next to our media intern and she talks about like tires. Should I do this? I think the best thing to do is don't do anything.
Right.
Drive the car as is. Your very first track day is not about how fast you go. It's to like learn the track, learn safety, learn this is what the car feels like. These are the people at the track, right? These are the flags. Those things are far more important. Your very first few track days are not, trying to beat the clock.
Funny story. When these cars first came out, I had a friend in the industry that worked for a company that came out with a complete product line of suspension upgrades and I'll just leave it at that. But all kinds of stuff that you could do to the car. Everything, and the whole catalog was applied to the car. It was a demo car. And I remember him telling me that the car just was not as fun to drive as it was before, because it felt like it was overly modded and took away from the confidence that he felt with more of a stock car. So to that point, I personally think it's a lot of fun to take a stock car, or at least the bare essentials for the longevity of the engine and the brakes, but take a basically stock car and then just make a couple changes, preferably one change at a time, but to kind of feel and see like, okay, what do sway bars do? What do coilovers do? What do tires do? And you can really learn a lot of lessons about modifying car that will carry with you for the rest of your life as you go on to the next chassis, or you even help your friends out with their track cars. But I think it's a lot of fun to do it that way.
You brought up a good point, because I want to say over-modding the car can actually get dangerous too, because you raise the limits of the car way past what you can drive.
Right,
so
right.
give you an example, like my first track day, I'm just going to put a big power adder like forced induction, or I'm just going to add like slicks on my first track day. Now the margin of error is so slim and the speeds you're going at are so much faster that it becomes dangerous at that point.
Yeah, and And one thing about these cars is, how originally in the press materials I talked about getting the center of gravity really low in these vehicles and all that, but you can really feel it when you drive these cars when they're set up. They make a ton of grip for what they are. The center of gravity is really low. The track is really wide, so that lets you keep as much grip as you can. So the wider track really helps with grip. But even on street tires, you can develop a lot of speed with some pretty basic mods on these cars. So if you start running, AO52 tires like Joe and the rest of those guys, like the cornering speeds get really intense, really fast.
Joe wanted to give some shout outs to some California track organizers. So specifically SpeedSF, On Grid, Hooked on Driving, Speed Ventures, so many groups available to run with. Yes, make sure to check out a track organizer and keep it off the streets. And Joe also says, come see me at SpeedSF. Joe, I still have nightmares about you at night. Attention SpeedSF drivers.
Yeah, one thing I'm really happy to see is we were at Buttonwillow this weekend, and it was a full house. Like, I don't think I've seen Buttonwillow that full and that packed with just a regular HPD event. And even for global time attack finals, there was fewer people on cars there than there were at like this last weekend. So I know we're in a pandemic and things have been rough, but I'm glad to see that at least people are getting back onto the track and maybe relieving some pent up energy, because it's good for the industry and good for our sanity, I think, too.
Weeb Speed says 8.6 stock class records are an indication of how capable the cars are with minimum mods and maximum driver.
Yeah, that's true.
And that's a very good point, because I completely forgot. Our sponsored driver, Kevin Schweigert, did something pretty amazing a couple weeks ago. What was that?
Yeah, I mean, Kevin has a really dialed in car that he's been working on for, I think he's been part of that whole group for more than 5 years, ever since they started originally racing. But he has a supercharged setup with lots of aero, lots of mods. But he ran a 135.9, I think it was, at Laguna Seca, which is pretty phenomenal for an FRS. But yeah, like Weep Speed was saying, even stock cars put down some pretty fast times that rival some modified cars from just 5 years before that.
The car savant just joined us, and that's Matthew, who I had that phone call with yesterday. Thank you for joining us, Matt. I'm really glad you joined us. And he says, waited all day for this with a sunglasses guy. Man, we've been waiting for you too, Matt. All right. So, did you have any more to add for like first day track tips? Or, getting into track driving with this chassis? If you guys have any additional questions, we're doing a BRZ FRS GT86 episode for this Instagram Live. Please ask us a question about this chassis. We have this chassis right behind us. This is Grant's personal car. If you want us to point out something, we can absolutely do that for you.
Actually, Ezekiel, I had a question for you.
Yeah.
If I'm taking a stock car to the track for the first time, one thing that's on my mind is, how are the fluids? Is what's in the car going to be able to hold up to my first time abusing it on track?
That's a very good question, because we kind of got into that with your boiling brake fluid, right?
Yeah.
So there's a few mandatory fluids that I would absolutely change. So brake is one. You need a high quality .4, flush out all the old stuff. Bring extra oil. This is a little bit controversial, but if you are been around boxers, boxers are burn oil, so bring some extra oil. Make sure to run a high quality oil. That's pretty much it. That coolant is pretty much a 100K lifetime coolant. I would say just change your brake fluid to a high quality .4 ahead of time, have a high quality oil, and then bring extra oil with you.
What about the trans and diff fluid? Because I remember people were saying that they were getting better shifting feel by changing out the stock fluid, and some people online were talking about how they didn't really feel that great with the stock fluid.
You know me as a transmission guy, we could have a whole 2-hour podcast just on that. So again, that's debatable too. I mean, I have my opinions on it. I'm not going to waste your guys' time with my opinions, but when I ran the season last year, there was a lot of guys just on the stock fluid at regular service intervals. And if that worked for them, that worked for them. But I would recommend a high quality transmission and rear diff gear oil. I would recommend, but it's not mandatory for your first few track days.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Oh, here's an interesting question. Owinjo asks, thank you for asking an easier question, Owinjo. Every time, I swear to God, I have a heart attack when I see you join. No, I'm just kidding. We appreciate you joining every time. Pedal dance or no? Which is better?
Oh, I mean, based on what we see on grid, I think everyone does the pedal dance. And if you guys aren't familiar, it's a pretty funny way that you have to. It's a way to defeat the factory traction control. So even if you hold down those two buttons in the center console, it doesn't completely turn it off. So for guys that completely limit it, they basically will be on grid and they'll turn off the key. They'll start pumping the brakes, the handbrake, and doing this whole dance to get it to completely shut off. But before every session, it seems to be what happens out there.
Yeah, T-Rod MR2 says, lol, I never liked pedal dance. Just be nice to the car and don't drive like a hack at Joe.
Damn.
And then Joe M Racing says, fight me with a kissy face at T-Rod MR2. Yeah. I have to disagree with this one. I pedal dance. I mean, just for me, all my cars have been very analog. Like my roster of cars has been like pre-90s cars. So it really, it's a shock to my system when throttle is taken away from me or brakes is applied when I don't want to. So that's a big shock to my system. I mean, I think we may have mentioned it last year. Even for me, driving a ABS car on track really was a shock to my system. I never quite figured out how to use ABS brakes properly on track, just because like my whole roster of cars my whole life has been all analog.
What do you mean? You just jam it as hard as you can and the car takes care of it.
Nope. Oh my God. Okay.
Well,
all
so
right.
I have a quick anecdote about that. I know what Ezekiel's saying because one time I had a rental car at a famous racetrack in Europe, and that car had a factory stability control that I couldn't turn off, and I was like booking it on this track. And I almost crashed because I was going around a turn expecting to lift the throttle and get the car to rotate, but instead the stability control kicked on and then straightened the car out, and it almost took me right off into the barriers. So, like, although I feel pretty comfortable behind the wheel, I think if you're on track, it's probably better to have it off regardless, is my opinion. That's what I'd recommend people if they ask me.
Joe made a really good point about the pedal dance. Doing a skid pad day and removing those nannies is in a safe and controlled coached environment is the way to go.
Yeah,
and
totally
I
agree.
completely agree with that. So Joe runs a lot of car control clinics, as does his buddy Nick Romano, who runs Fast Sideways. And yeah, best way to do it. You are coached and it's a safe and controlled environment.
Yeah,
best way to do it.
You guys are doing you guys have a great asset for the community by being approachable and having these track days, these skid pad days that really let people get comfortable with having oversteer and having general car control, which we've heard from people before has helped them in scary situations on the streets as well. So it's a huge benefit to the community. I hope you guys keep doing it.
We have about 15 minutes left in the live, and for you guys just joining us, we are doing a BRZ, FRS, and GT86 specific topic today. If you guys have any questions, please make sure to ask us in this remaining 15 minutes.
So should we answer Ant's question here?
Sure. So 444_Ant asked us a question ahead of time on our Instagram. How does a good suspension setup / set of coilovers actually affect your car?
There's, God, I can't remember the publication, but there was, actually, I think it was Grassroots Motorsports. They did a really cool comparison where I think they took like a BMW or something, and they did a test with stock suspension and springs and shocks, some not so expensive coilovers, and then some high-end coilovers. And they did a subjective test to talk about how the car felt, and they also had an objective test to look at the lap times. The short takeaway is if you have any reasonable coilover that's that has some thought put into it, put on the car, you are most likely going to drop your lap times quite a bit over the stock setup, strictly because having those higher spring rates allow you to keep more weight on all four corners rather than overloading the outside, as what happens when the car rolls on stock suspension. And after that, when you get to the point where you are progressing as a driver, you can start to look into a nicer damper that can help you in a few ways. One of the main things is it's like, systems like ours that are tuned for berms or just tuned for track in general. They're going to help the car to feel more settled over those kind of disturbances, and that allows you to push the car harder as a driver. So although on a steady state corner you might have similar grip as you would with a just an off-the-shelf coiler system, it really starts to come into play when you go to a bumpier track or start to focus on transitions or other aspects on track. So yeah, in short, I think having a developed shock absorber and coilover setup will just let you feel more comfortable in the car and let you get the most out of it and feel more confident behind the wheel. And yeah, that's probably the biggest takeaway in that.
So I have a question for you that I get a lot of customer inquiries about. So let's say I have a street car that on the weekends I'll do some canyon carving. I want the car a little bit lower, but not like a dramatically low ride height. The most important thing for me is like I daily drive this thing, and I want it to be comfortable for my commute, but I still want it to handle well in the canyons. Why should I get Annex? Why shouldn't I just get some, lowering springs and shocks?
Yeah, and actually, this is cool because we're focusing on this car, so we can talk about some specifics for these cars, these FT86 platforms. But yeah, I mean, there are plenty of good spring and shock combos out there. There's a couple brands that come to mind, but one of the things that you can do with a higher quality set of dampers is you can actually get away with a higher spring rate and still maintain good ride quality. That's one big benefit of having a really nice damper with on a coilover system. So, for example, actually I don't know the spring rates for lowering springs, so we haven't looked into that because it's not our area of expertise. But in general, lowering springs are usually softer than a coilover setup. But on our street setup, we usually will set someone up with a 6K spring rate or maybe a 7K spring rate, sometimes staggered, like where we have a lower spring rate in the front than the rear. But that's, in terms of wheel rate, that's kind of high for a car that's just mainly driving on the street. But it works out really well. The cars absorb bumps. They're fun to drive in the canyons, and having a good damper that's paired with that spring allows you to kind of enjoy the benefits of having a firmer ride without being overly harsh or uncomfortable. So for these cars in particular, if you are mainly driving to if you're mainly driving to work or going to the canyons and occasionally going to the track maybe a couple times a year, I think a really nice setup is like a 7K spring rate front and rear with some larger sway bars, preferably adjustable, so you can fine tune the handling balance. But that setup is just really nice. It's you can have people ride in the car, and it's not embarrassing to take people out. But especially with addition to those sway bars, you can get the benefits of having higher spring rates and being able to have fun in the twisties, but still use the car as a car, on a daily basis.
We have a couple comments about lowering springs. So T-Rod MR2 says, like you said before, car has no travel, drop springs, and most shocks ride on the bump stops. And very exciting, Burstcraft is our newest. Sorry about that, Burstcraft. Burstcraft just became an official dealer for Annex Suspension. Thank you so much, man. We are so excited to begin working with you. Hopefully we can see each other soon, because I know we're like down the street from each other, man. And Burstcraft says, +1 to that riding on the bump stops comment. Yet to ride in a lowering spring car that didn't smash those. DC5 Twisties asks, will you guys ride along with me for feedback on my next track day? And I wanted to read that because August 22nd, our team will be at Laguna Seca. So make sure to come check out our tent and come say hi to us, ask us questions. We should have a demo set of S2000 CSP out there for you to look at and touch.
Yeah, definitely look forward to meeting you. Hopefully you come out to the track. And Yeah, come by. If you see us and if we're at the track at the same time and you're going out, come see us. We can, it'd be nice to get a ride along and see how your car's doing.
About 9 minutes left in the live, you guys. Make sure to get your questions answered. For those who just joined us, BRZ, FRS, and GT86 Chassis. Cali Boosts asks, do you have an opinion on how low the BRZ should be lowered? I've heard it's a bad idea to go lower than 1 inch, as the BRZ geometry will be thrown off. We talked a little bit about that beforehand.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure about absolute numbers, but I think for a street-driven car, if you see the gray, this car actually, if you see this car on our social media and the ride height that it's at, I don't think you want to go a whole lot lower than that for a usable daily driver. For one, just so you don't damage the axles and the other components, but also it becomes a pain if you can't pull out of driveways and you keep clipping those curbs in parking lots that you pull up to when you pull in. Like if you're constantly having to worry about like damaging your car driving it, like it's not so fun, yeah, the car might look a little cooler if you're like that half-inch lower or whatever, but it's just nice to be able to just enjoy the car at a height that looks nice and is usable. So yeah, my advice is not to go a whole lot lower than that.
Cool. Yeah, feel free if you have anything else you want to bring up.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to start talking more about track setups for these cars, but we've got a couple people on the live stream that actively track these cars. So if you guys have any specific questions about that, it'd be great to ask in the comments or ask us. I can tell you one thing that we're playing around with now for these cars is we have worked with a few drivers in this 8-6 Drive Challenge race series, and they have been progressing, meaning like lap times are dropping, they're adding more power, they're going faster and faster. And one new area that we're excited to look into is working with drivers that have really fast cars. So by that I mean, like, Kevin is a great example, Kevin Schweigert. So I think he's making somewhere around like 400 wheel horsepower, and that car is seriously rapid. And a lot of that is because of the downforce and other race car mods that he's done. And we're finding that does require a different type of tuning on the dampers. And so we're head into that right now. And it's actually really exciting because this is kind of like it's like a new engineering challenge for us to look at to see what kind of additional options we need to build into our calculator to work well with an aero setup. And I'm looking forward to what we're going to learn this year. And just to give you guys some context, like this, I remember Kevin was saying that 120 miles an hour, his aero package makes something like 600 pounds of downforce front and rear, roughly. I don't remember the exact numbers, but it's a pretty serious aero package. And he stepped up from a 10K in the front and 10K in the rear spring rate setup, and is now testing out an 11K in the front and a 12K in the rear setup, which is the highest that we've gone so far in this chassis. And it does require us to valve the dampers a little bit differently. That being said, we do have one driver. We have Joe that's actually going to push even further on the spring rates. He's going to be testing a 12K and a 14K in the rear setup. And I think that's going to be interesting also. So although we've been doing this for a couple of years, we're still learning more, and we're looking forward to getting to that even farther end of the spectrum for prepping these race cars.
Joe M Racing says, lol, nope, 350-ish for Kevin, which I thought was really impressive considering I've been on track with cars with 100 or 200 more horsepower, not even close to that lap time. Do you want to answer that?
Sure, yeah. So WeebSpeed's asking how to set up a suspension for aero. Yeah, and like I was saying, that's something that we're experimenting with right now. But the current theories are that you're going to we want to run a higher spring rate for a couple of reasons. One is that when you have that much downforce on the car, it's actually pushing the car into the ground as the car is picking up in speed. And how do you make that downforce? You have splitters and diffusers that hang lower on the vehicle than the car would be even stock. So you have even more of an incentive to keep the car off the ground. So as it's pushing down, you got to be able to push back up on that. So these cars will typically use a higher spring rate to keep it off the ground. And that also means that our compression valving needs to be tweaked for that. And so we're trying higher and lower compression settings right now to see what's working best. Empirically, we've heard from other people that they wanted to run a higher compression on an aero setup, but we've also seen from other drivers that you may not want to do that. So still have a lot more testing to do on that. But yeah, so in general, you can and should run a higher spring rate than you would on a non-aero car. Actually, one thing that I learned that I wasn't aware of before getting to these racing activities is cars with aero usually stay off the berms entirely. Because the diffuser is hanging, the splitter's hanging so low to the ground, you could damage it if you hit a berm. But also when you're making so much force that if you pick up the car on that berm and lift it, you're messing up the downforce that you have, and it'll get very unstable very quickly. So a car with a really developed aero package, you'll often see them actually avoiding the berms entirely, whereas that would have been the fastest setup before if you would just nail and hammer over those berms. But a lot of times you'll see aero cars just go around them because they need to, and because they're making so much grip that they're able to just drive around it rather than take the shortest path. So I thought that was pretty interesting.
T-Rod MR2 has an interesting comment. Top time attack cars, high spring rate, but eventually run into bump stops. Tune stops, but also some cars starting to run a third spring setup. Are you familiar with that third spring setup?
No, I'm not. I mean, I know there's dampers that control pitch, but yeah, I'm not sure what he means by the third spring.
T-Rod MR2, please let us know, what is the third spring?
It could be another name for something that I'm just not familiar with.
Yeah. For you guys on the live, we're doing BRZ FRS GT86, and we are almost out of time. Looks like just about 2 or 3 minutes left, so make sure to get your last minute questions in. On the other side of that, we could probably show the car too if you wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, sure.
Okay. Time's up. Why don't we take a look at Grant's car? For you guys listening on audio podcast or YouTube, make sure to take advantage of the live because we'll show you guys some cool stuff like this.
Oh, push rod suspension. Okay.
Yeah, cool. So yeah, if you want to pick up the phone, we can go walk around the car.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, cool. Yeah, let's do that.